David.
Okay. Let's do that right now.
It doesn't show for me that it's on Facebook.
Okay, thank you. I'll go and do it again then. Is Monty here?
I don't see him, Monty. I haven't seen him yet.
Okay, let me try and see what's going on Facebook. I'll be right back.
Okay, all right. And then Laura, I see you're here from Maryland. Good morning.
And I will read the scripture. It's very brief and sort of whimsical, I think, but Psalm 133. How very good and pleasant it is when kindred live together in unity.
Happy family.
Okay, how very good and pleasant it is when kindred live together in unity. Now, listen to these words. It's kind of funny, I think. It is like the precious oil on the head, running down upon the beard, on the beard of Aaron, running down over the collar of his robes. It is like the dew of Hermon, which falls on the mountains of Zion. For there the Lord ordained his blessing, life forevermore. So let's begin with prayer. Dear God, it is good to be together when we are not at each other's throats. Too often that is the case. We hope and pray that will not be the case today. We hope that we will be able to say at the end of this session that it was good to be together and not dispiriting to be so. We are thankful also for Dr. Bruinsma. I think he's concluding the 4th series with us today, and we hope to have more from him in the future. Please bless him, please bless us as we consider the life and thought of Dr. Desmond Ford. In Christ's name, amen. One little comment before we get really going here, and that is, I think I've mentioned in the past that if we have trouble of some sort with people invading us, I'll just shut things down and I'll send you a new sign-in information email, and within 3 or 4 minutes we'll be back on. So that's the protocol. Now, I'm not quite sure why I'm not getting everybody here. There we go. Now, I am speaking, and I think Dr. Bruinsma is somewhere. I don't see him.
Yes,
there
he is.
you
He's
are.
here. He's here.
There he is. Welcome, sir.
Thank you.
Over to you.
All right. Well, indeed, that I didn't count the number of series that I've been with you, but this last one has certainly been a somewhat extended one, but a pleasant one. I hope that most of you have experienced it that way. It was not something that just was always within my area of expertise, but I've tried to make the best of it. And it's certainly, when we are going to talk about Desmond Ford tonight, this morning, I have a feeling that there are certainly a number of people in this group who would be better qualified to give this talk than I actually am. Some of you have had much closer connections with the Ford issues than I have had. But I have met Dr. Ford once, and that was not long before his death. I'd been invited to be a speaker at a camp meeting in New South Wales in Australia. And on Sabbath morning, as I was sitting waiting to be called up onto the podium in the big tent, somebody touched my shoulder. And when I looked back, I saw it was a lady whom I did not know. And she said, "I'm Gillian Ford. And my husband would be very happy if he could meet with you. He is not well enough to come here, but would it be possible for you to come and meet with him?" Now, it so happened that their home was, I think, about 50 kilometers away from where the camp meeting was. And so I was taken by somebody to the forts, and I spent the better part of an afternoon with Desmond Ford and his wife. And I must say that I was extremely impressed with Ford. And we had a very, very pleasant exchange. And I value that meeting with him very, very much. The only other time that I heard him speak was when I was working at Andrews University, and he was meeting, but could not give, he was giving a talk, but he could not give his talk on campus. So it was close to the Andrews campus where he gave his talk, and I sat somewhere in the back of the audience and listened to him, but had no chance to meet with him. But I'm happy that I did meet with him just shortly before his death. Now, let's see. I noticed that that David sent an email message, was it? And exhorting us not to talk too much about Clay's Review, but more about some of the other things that Desmond Ford has done. That's a little difficult, David, because I had already prepared my my PowerPoint, my talk, but I'll do my best, and you just turn us in the right way if you feel that I'm not sufficiently doing that.
Okay, maybe I can interject here. I was referring to our discussion time.
Okay.
You should feel free to go through your presentation as you had it, not changing it a bit, but sometimes in our discussions, we sort of go downhill, and I'm concerned that we not do that in our discussion time. Let's think about what you will say, and let's think about Dr. Ford. I fear that Glacier View sometimes is all we think about. We have to go through it today, and your presentation is for that purpose. But I would like to hear in the discussion time from people like Dr. Tishy, who have been blessed by his ministry, and others. So don't change what you had in mind at all. But in the discussion period, we'll be a little bit vigilant.
Okay. I'm going to try to bring the PowerPoint on screen. You didn't see that last week, David, but it just happened to go smoothly. I did something right, so we'll see whether that could happen again.
He practiced all week, David.
Well, it's always gone smoothly.
Let's see now. No, it's not there yet. Let's see. Screen.
Did you touch the share box?
Here it comes.
You're up.
We're there. Well, that wasn't too bad, was it? Okay. Desmond Ford. Heretic or prophet? Well, maybe there are other options, but this is for now the question. Desmond Ford was born in 1929 in Townsville in Queensland, Australia. Not long before his birth, his parents had come in first contact with Adventism through a colporteur. His parents divorced when he was 9, and so Desmond moved with his mother and brother to Sydney. Dropped out of school, but subsequently took night classes. At age 15, he was employed by a newspaper as a copy boy, but gradually they also gave him some editorial work, and he was good at it. He became, or was, a fervent reader, was baptized in the Adventist Church in 1946, so he was about 17 baptized, and then shortly afterwards began his studies at the Australian Missionary College, what is now Avondale University. And there he graduated from the ministerial course. That was not a course that ended in a degree, but it gave the possibility to start doing ministerial work. And so he pastored a few churches in New South Wales and soon was married with Gwen Booth, his first wife, and with her he had 3 children. He returned to Avondale and there received his Bachelor of Arts in 1958. Moved on with Gwen to the States and had his master's at the Adventist Seminary, which was then still in Washington. While in the States, he did his PhD at the Michigan State University. Returning to Australia, he became the head of the religion department at Avondale, what was then Avondale College. 1970, in April, his wife died, and later in the year, he remarried with his current, well, his second wife. I shouldn't say his current wife, but because Jill is now, of course, his widow, Gillian Westell. He had another leave and went to the University of Manchester, where he got a PhD with the thesis, The Abomination of Desolation in Biblical Eschatology. And this already points in some direction as to where his interests were. His supervisor was the famous F.F. Bruce, and I think they remained in contact throughout his life. Tensions developed between Desmond and church leadership. Much had to do with the Bruinsma, and we'll talk about it a little more, the Bruinsma problem, issue of perfection, and the relationship between justification and sanctification. Because there was this problem, this tension in Australia, it was decided that he would spend some time away from Australia. And so in 1977, he moved to Pacific Union College in the United States. A key moment was October 1979, when he gave a lecture for the Association of Adventist Forums. And about 1,000 people were present at that particular lecture. And there he said a number of things, gave a number of his theories and beliefs that had many people worried, and some people were so excited that it caused an enormous amount of stir around the United States. He was summoned to Washington as a result, and he was given a 6-month leave to write a document to outline his views. Eventually, this led to the famous Glacier View meetings, and as a result, he was later in that year dismissed from the Seventh-day Adventist ministry, lost his credentials. He may have lost his credentials, but he did not lose his faith. And so he remained a preacher and established the Good News Unlimited organization. In 2000, he retired and moved back to Australia. And in 2008, Milton Hook published a biography of Desmond Ford. I read that book, I think about 4 or 5 years ago. And although it seems a little bit of a hagiography, it's clearly that Milton Hook was an admirer of Desmond Ford. But even though it maybe has some of those characteristics, I concluded that even if half of that is true, then really this man has been terribly mistreated by his church. And he deserves to be called a hero because of his ability to continue and be positive and be a blessing for so many people. So March 11, 2019, he died in his home at the Sunshine Coast in Queensland, Australia. So this is very briefly the biography of Dr. Desmond Ford. As I already mentioned, one of the important developments in his life was the issue around Robert Bruinsma. Now, Bruinsma was born in August 1933, Victoria, Australia. His family had a background in Reform Adventism. And maybe that was an element that became significant also in the life of Robert Bruinsma. He was already known to be a somewhat difficult student, a critical student when he was studying for the ministry at Avondale. And soon he advocated, when he had left Avondale, a form of perfectionism and started a movement, the Sanctuary Awakening Fellowship. The key tenet in that Awakening Fellowship was the fact that the believer, every believer, is a temple of the living God. And when we talk about the sanctuary message and the fact that the heavenly temple must be cleansed, then Bruinsma said it's not only the temple in heaven, but it's also our soul temple that must be cleansed. Believers can be perfect. And here we recognize some of the things that we find today also in the last generation theology. Christ had a whole post-fall nature. He remained perfect while he had a sinful nature, just as Adam had after the fall. And so if Christ could be perfect, then the believers should also be able to be perfect. He rejected the element of judgment in the 1844 doctrine. Well, there was a lot of interchange between Bruinsma and Ford. Ford eventually convinced Bruinsma to reject the perfectionism. From the 1970s onwards, Bruinsma was following another track, defended the Protestant principles for a number of years, but later embraced liberalism and then gave up the theological interests altogether. But the relationship between Bruinsma and Ford and Bruinsmadism was important, certainly in the early period of Ford's ministry. Ford helped to calm down the turmoil around the Bruinsma movement. Now, the Bruinsma movement was not as strong everywhere in the world, but even in Europe, it had a very significant impact on the church. And it had people, for instance, in the Netherlands, there were also followers of Bruinsma, and significantly, the key people in the Netherlands in the Bruinsma movement, as it was called, were people who had also come out of the Reform movement. Ford took the lead in promoting new insights about obedience, against legalism, and the importance of grace as the saving element in our relationship with Christ. Some felt that Ford was teaching cheap grace, that he talked too much about grace and not enough about the law. They felt there was an antinomian emphasis in his teachings. Antinomian, the Greek word for law is nomos, and so antinomian is against the law. That was a feeling that too much grace, too little law. The balance, they said, was not there. And some of the people who were extremely worried, Herbert Douglas, Kenneth Wood. Kenneth Wood was for a long time the editor of the Review and Herald in the United States. And significantly, those two were also very important persons in the defense of the last generation theology. In Australia, those who were unhappy about what was happening and were unhappy with Desmond Ford, they were the CBs, as they were called, the concerned brethren, the CBs. At first, when I heard that, I wondered what that meant, that term, but then later I was told the meaning of CBs. With Ford on the side of defense of grace, and was in particular Edward Heppenstall against perfectionism. And he maintained that sinless people do not need grace, but the rest of us, we do. There was the question, and we won't go into that, but was righteousness by faith exclusively justification, or did it also include sanctification? And I must admit that I have never been very interested in this kind of questions, as if we can exactly say where one ends and where the other begins. The difficulties and the controversy led to calling a conference. That's what we do in our church in 1976, the Palmdale Conference. And Ford read a number of papers. Others read papers defending last generation theology. but the tension between the viewpoints remained and the issues were not solved. We already mentioned the important forum presentation at PUC. Ford defended his views of soteriology. That's the technical name that theologians use for the science of salvation, the discipline, subdiscipline in theology that deals with salvation. And he defended his view and his view of justification, but also touched on some other conclusions that he had reached having to do with the heavenly sanctuary and with the meaning of 1844. Soon after the forum meeting, the tapes began to circulate and they were sent all over the world, reached Australia very soon. And there Ford was immediately almost accused of circulating those tapes. And that was incorrect. Ford did not do that. In fact, just a few years ago, in 2007, it came to light that the copies had actually come from Mrs. Figuur, the wife of the General Conference president at that time, who had shared copies with a friend, a physician at St. Helena Hospital in California. And so it was not Ford who had been circulating those tapes, but they came from a totally different source. But it was only in 2007 that that was revealed. Desmond Ford was then released from his teaching assignment. He was asked to prepare a statement about his views and moved for temporarily to Washington. GC appointed a 12-person committee to guide Ford in his studies, but they were of very little use and could not convince Ford to change his views. They did not play such a major role. So Ford then, after the forum presentation, is on leave and preparing a document that the church, the brethren, will study and take it from there. So in preparation for Glacier View, Ford wrote a document entitled Daniel 8:14, the Day of Atonement and the Investigative Judgment. And the whole document is about 900 pages, 300 pages containing the main substance with some 600 pages in appendices. And it's good to see the chapter headings of this document. And the version that I have is in 3 little volumes, and they follow this order. The history of the sanctuary problems in the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Because the doctrine of the sanctuary, it's often said that it is the most unique doctrine that we have, but it is also the most controversial doctrine that we have. And several key people actually have struggled with that with that doctrine, and a number of them have actually left the church as a result of that. One of them being, for instance, Louis Conradi, the leader of the church in Europe. Chapter 2 about Hebrews and the Day of Atonement. Chapter 3, Daniel and the Day of Atonement. 4, Revelation and the Day of Atonement. 5, possible resolution of the problem. And then 6, Ellen G. White, 1844, and the Day of Atonement. Well, again, a conference was going to be held. a sanctuary review committee was formed with about 125 members, theologians, and also a large number of administrators. And of this 125 members, eventually 114 attended at Glacier View. In August 1980, the famous Sanctuary Review Conference at Glacier View took place. It's a vacation or a conference center that the church opens in Colorado. Been there just once, and then I was not aware of the fact that it's actually so high up in the mountains. So I was constantly out of breath, but then only later realized how high it actually is. The meetings became very political, and there was in particular a lot of pressure from the Australian church leaders. They simply did not want to continue with Desmond Ford. Those who attended the Glacier View conference said that unfortunately many scholars who in fact largely or fully agreed with Ford were very silent. They sensed that maybe their job would be on the line if they were seen as in complete agreement with Ford. Ford, many people said, was seen as quite inflexible, maybe too inflexible. There was an attempt to come to some kind of consensus, to see where the parties could agree, and 2 consensus statements were actually voted. But also a document with 10 points where it was listed where Ford differed from official doctrine. He was asked to take his views or leave his views, but he was unwilling to recant. The Review and Herald and the ministry, as you know, the ministry is the journal for the worldwide ministry of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. They reported extensively, but very unbalanced and very anti-Ford. Well, in the Review and Herald, there was still the same editor, and there was no way that there was a fair hearing for Ford in these church journals. And there remained a pressure coming from Australia that something concrete needed to be done with regard to the employment of Desmond Ford. And so there was a meeting of the Australian Division Committee and the Avondale Board. They held a secret ballot. As a result, Ford lost his ministerial credentials. His ordination was not annulled, and he also was not disfellowshipped, but he lost his ministerial credentials. And that, of course, was a very significant move. After Glacier View, Ford continued to be very influential. He started the ministry Good News Unlimited, wrote books, and was a very popular international speaker. But when we look at the issues between Ford and the church, we must say that the issues actually have never been solved, in the sense that the church has changed its position, and the issues have continued to cause polarization, even today. When after I visited Australia the last time, a couple of years ago, I noticed that we met so many people who said, well, I was a pastor once upon a time. So many ex-pastors. At least about 180 pastors in Australia and New Zealand were fired or were resigned, were pushed to resign or resigned from their own volition. There's an unknown influence among pastors elsewhere in the world, but also elsewhere in the world, there were many victims. There is a very careful research done by Peter Ballis, Leaving the Adventist Ministry, a study of the process of exiting, and that deals specifically with the exits of Adventist pastors after the Ford, after Glacier View. Reality is, although we do not have clear scientific data, but the reality is that today, many pastors and even many church leaders worldwide, they tend secretly or not so secretly to support some or all of Ford's views. The Biblical Research Institute reactivated the Daniel and Revelation Study Committee, and they came with a number of major publications defending the traditional views. So what were the main issues that were there between Ford and the church? I have listed 6 issues. One of them was the so-called year-day principles. A lot of our exegesis of the books of Daniel and Revelation is based on the idea that there are prophecies where you have one day symbolizing one full year. Now, this is based on actually 2 texts in the Bible, Numbers 14:34 and Ezekiel 4:6. Now, if you read those texts, then it's hard to see that they actually deal with giving us a principle for interpreting a prophecy. This has nothing to do with the time prophecies that we find in Daniel and Revelation. This year-day principle was not an Adventist invention, but early Adventist authors adopted this from Protestant historicist interpreters. In a very interesting article in Spectrum, published in 1985 by Raymond Cottrell. Cottrell was involved in the development of the Seventh-day Adventist Bible Commentary, and there he published this fascinating article, The Untold Story of the Bible Commentary. And he wrote about the challenges that he had as the associate editor of this 7-volume piece. And he writes, what should an editor do with proof texts that inherently do not prove what is traditionally attributed to them? As for instance, Numbers 14:34 and Ezekiel 4:6, the texts about day, year. In most of these and a number of other passages, now listen, pastoral concern led us to conclude that the commentary was not the place to make an issue of the Bible verses traditional interpretation, much as this disappointed us as Bible scholars and would be a disappointment to our scholarly friends who know better. So here is an acknowledgement that actually when they were putting the Bible commentary together, they knew that the interpretation of the year-day principle did not hold water. But yet it was continued because of what they call pastoral concerns. Well, the issue is still with us, and many scholars today, maybe even the majority of Adventist scholars, would find it difficult to defend the year-day principle. So that's one issue. Another issue is, how do we deal with prophecy in general? Apocalyptic prophecy. And it's here that Desmond Ford introduced an interesting principle, which he called the Apothematic Principle, which means, and here's a short quotation, that a prophecy fulfilled or fulfilled in part or unfulfilled at the appointed time may have a later or recurring or consummated fulfillment. So a prophecy may have several fulfillments. It may not have just one and then we can forget about it. Thus, for instance, the little horn could be fulfilled in a number of powers. It does not necessarily just have to be papal Rome, but it could also be Antiochus Epiphanes. It could be fulfilled in pagan Rome, in papal Rome, and in Satan's manifestation just before and after the millennium. So rather than saying little horn is the papacy, that's it, Desmond Ford says, no, this prophecy that there is a power that is against God's people, that does all these horrible things, that is something that may repeat itself several times. And we should not be just solely focused on papal Rome. It was, by the way, a term that Ford borrowed from George McGrady Price, who is known in particular for his statements, his books about the creation evolution debate at that time. But he also wrote what is considered to be quite a good book about the prophecies of Daniel. So the term apothematic was actually borrowed from George McGrady Price. The concept was not totally new, and other Adventist scholars have also said that we should be ready to recognize particular patterns. When you look at a prophecy, it's not just something that is fulfilled in one particular historic event, but for instance, Kenneth Strand said that we should be looking for similar patterns throughout history. And so that comes close to what Desmond Ford was saying, that a prophecy can have more than one fulfillment. The issue became rather acute, of course, because of the fact that Ford said and emphasized rather strongly that the events that were prophesied in Daniel did actually reflect mostly what was happening in the 2nd century during Antiochus Epiphanes IV, when the temple was destroyed and was the sanctity of the temple was taken away, whatever the word is. And so this is a a thing that causes a lot of debate in Adventist circles. Can we say that most of what is stated in Daniel actually reflects 2nd century rather than some other period? You could also say that Ford's solution is akin to what is called the idealistic interpretation of Daniel and Revelation. You know, you have historicism, you have futurism, and there is also idealism saying, well, we should not specifically look at a particular time when these prophecies are fulfilled, but this is the kind of thing that tends to happen as history takes its course. So that's the second major issue, prophecy. The heavenly sanctuary. Questions. Is there a two-phase ministry? Did the second phase, if there is such a second phase, begin in 1844? How do we approach the sanctuary doctrine? Do we approach it through Leviticus, starting there from the Old Testament? Or, as Ford emphasized, do we approach it from Hebrews, where Christ seems to begin his priestly or high priestly ministry after his ascension? That is one of the key issues. Another one is, what exactly do some of these terms mean? The sanctuary is cleansed, or as others say, is justified. What does it mean? Well, Ford's conclusion, and this was maybe the most difficult to swallow. The doctrine of the investigative judgment, he concluded, is unscriptural, is based on a number of assumptions rather than scriptural proof. And saying that was unacceptable to most of our leaders at that time and today. Together with that, next issue is the investigative judgment. The traditional view of the investigative judgment is expressed in the Great Controversy. The work of examination of character, of determining who are prepared for the kingdom of God, is that of the investigative judgment. When the cases of those who in all ages have professed to be followers of Christ have been examined and decided, then probation will close. The books of record in heaven, in which the names and the deeds of men, and I suppose also women, are registered, are to examine the decisions of the judgment. And then when it closes, the investigative judgment, the destiny of all will have been decided for life and death. Well, Ford says we may find that in the Great Controversy, but it's very difficult. No, it's impossible to find that in the Bible. And so he was convinced that the investigative judgment is a concept that is unscriptural. The term investigative judgment was first used in 1857, so it goes back to the beginnings of Seventh-day Adventism. The concept was further developed by such men as Uriah Smith and G.N. Andrews. E.G. White did not originate the sanctuary doctrine. Most of her writings on the topic is actually from somewhat later, from the 1880s onwards. It has continued to be a problem for many Seventh-day Adventists. And some give lip service to it without actually understanding what it means, what it's supposed to mean, and others have come to the conclusion that really the investigative judgment is something that cannot be supported from the Bible. You may have noticed that more recently, we don't talk so much about investigative judgment, but we talk about the pre-Advent judgment. And there is not so much, well, it's recognized that it has often been a source of much fear for many church members. If our name comes up in the investigative judgment, are we going to make it? Have we been good enough? Have we not forgotten to confess some of our sins? But from fear now in our writings, in our Sabbath school lessons and other stuff, we try to say that actually the judgment is a good thing, because that is where our salvation will be validated. Well, there is the continuing dilemma that many recognize that, and they think that Ford was right, that no clear biblical support exists for the doctrine of investigative judgment. And this then has very much to do with the next issue, namely that of Ellen White. What is then the nature of the authority of Ellen White? Because if we can say that her view with regard to the investigative judgment is something that we do not want to follow, then where is Ellen White? Well, she should not be seen, Ford says, as somebody who may define doctrine for us. Her writings were rather pastoral, homiletic, and not exegetical. So he says that is in line with what Ellen White herself said, that she refused in many cases to be an arbiter of doctrine. She said that were others who should study that and make those decisions. So those are the main issues that resulted from the work of Desmond Ford. Now, many of these issues were not new, but he brought them forward in a very well-argued way, and the church had to deal with that. That was extremely difficult. And well, we are still dealing with it. Desmond Ford was not treated well by the church. He did not have a chance at Glacier View. It was clear that, in particular, the leaders in Australia did not want to see him continue as a teacher, as a professor, or as an important speaker voice in the Adventist Church. But Ford continued to be a minister of the gospel in writing, in speaking. He started the group Good News Unlimited. And the greatness of Desmond Ford, in my view, is that he actually never became bitter. And he actually never became an enemy of the church. On the contrary. And even in the final years of his life, he was always attending Seventh-day Adventist Church. And in a local church close to where he lived, he would teach a Sabbath school class and be always in support. And when I visited him that afternoon, a couple of years ago, during that talk, there was not one negative statement about the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Desmond Ford was not a saint. But I think, from what I know, what I have read, from what I've heard from people who knew him better, that he was a gifted, sincere Bible scholar and a preacher who has been a blessing for many. And as I just said, in spite of the treatment he received, he did not become a bitter enemy of the church. And it has been pointed out by Milton Hook and also by others that some promises that were given to him at Glacier View were not kept. And unfortunately, some did not support him for fear of losing employment or their own leadership role. Subsequently, he was often shunned, not allowed to speak in SDA churches, and even after his death, it was impossible to have a service in memory of him on the campus of Avondale University. He was never formally rehabilitated, and I don't know whether it will ever be posthumously done. We must say that his obituaries, the obituaries were mostly, I've called it decent, balanced, even in the official church journals. Well, what is the way forward? The issues are still with us. But it would seem to me that it's essential that we know more about actually what happened. We should tell it as it was and acknowledge that things were not done in the right way. Richard Hamill played an important role at Glacier View. He was then the president of Andrews. He later wrote in his autobiography that he is not proud of the role that he played there. If you want a very good survey of the Desmond Ford story, go to the new ESDA Encyclopedia, which is an online encyclopedia. Just go ESDA and then find the article by Jill Valentine on Desmond Ford. That's an extremely well-researched and balanced article. I think that it's essential that more people know actually what happened and what are the things that maybe we should look at again. It's important, I believe, that it is that we show that there has often been diversity of opinion regarding doctrine, and it has often been possible to live with that, and it should be possible to live with that again. It is also important to show that there have actually been doctrines and practices that have changed. So why not have more change if that is needed? We should allow for and stimulate open dialogue, and maybe also admit that some positions that we have long held are no longer tenable. Maybe that's most what I can say about it. Discourage hostilities, yes, and partisanship. Focus more on elements of agreement, but important is in particular that we feel free that we can talk about it, that leaders and pastors also feel free that they can discuss this without immediately being suspect, and knowing what actually happened, and well, try to see the ministry of Desmond Ford in a positive light. So some of the things that we might discuss. Do you see Desmond Ford as a heretic or a prophet? Or would you have another term for him? Would you agree with me that Ford should be posthumously be rehabilitated? But there is the question also, how can doctrine change? And the investigative judgment, is that a core doctrine? Or is that a fringe idea that we might give up? Thus, giving up certain doctrines endanger the existence of the church. That is what some people say. Once you start doing that, then the Adventist church is going down the drain. Well, maybe some of you are a secret or an open Fordite. Does it matter? I have never made a secret of the fact that I, in fact, have always believed most of the things that Desmond Ford was promoting. And there is the question that I asked earlier, should a minister resign or be dismissed if she no longer believes in certain of the 28 fundamental beliefs? Or should that be possible, that we have some diversity when it comes to our beliefs? This is the last of the 8 presentations in this series. We talked about Erasmus and Arminius and Wesley, and then Mrs. Fiorenza, Boff, Sulle, Kung, and now Ford. They were all in some way dissenters. When, at what stage does dissent become rebellion, destructive? I don't feel that any of these persons actually have been rebellious and destructive, but some felt that they were. At what point might discipline be needed? Well, should efforts be made towards rehabilitation? I already mentioned that. But an important question, does God sometimes use dissenters to bring renewal, correction? I believe he does. And that dissenting voices may trouble the waters, but they can also bring positive change. So that is where I give it back to you, David.
Thank you very much. Thank you. This has been very helpful. And we can, if the group wants to, we can turn back to that list of questions that you put on the board, and we can discuss one or more or all of them. I know what will happen. At the end, we will be of different convictions on all of those issues, and we will regret that we've been here. This has been going on for 40 years. No, I misstated. This has been going on since 1957. That's when all of this began, with the questions on doctrine book. And so think how long we've been at each other's throats on this issue, since 1957. Now, I will say this. Dr. Bruinsma is like a weatherman. He's in the studio looking at the storm coming. He can explain the storm. He can talk about the size of the storm. He can go on, and, but he is not there in the storm. The storm feels differently if you're standing beside a house that's been blown down by it and people are dead inside. Now, do we want to talk about all the people whose marriages broke up about this, whose friendships broke up about this, congregations that were divided about this, people who attempted suicide because of this? Do we want to talk about that? Or should we just say, let's put that in the past and let's talk about the good things we all know Dr. Ford did. And that is, all over the world, people whose lives were spiritually dried up, were renewed by him. Thousands of people. And for us to concentrate on that list of questions or any others that just continue the debate that has started since 1957, we can do that. I really hope we don't, but we'll do that. We'll let the conversation go wherever the conversation wants to go, but that's my own view of it. I was there where the house got blown down. I know people who tried to commit suicide because they had been told that for the whole of their lives, they had been preaching a false gospel. Okay? So if we want to go down that street, we can go down that street. My request is that we talk about what we all know to be true, and that is thousands of people were blessed by Dr. Ford's ministry. Let's talk about that.
Well, I very much agree with that, David, and let's not put that list back on the screen. Maybe some of these questions can be there in the background, and some may want to refer to one or two of those questions. But yeah, and maybe it would be good even if you were to say a few more things about this, because you have actually also from very close by in your family been involved with a lot of this, isn't it?
Well, that's precisely what I don't want to do.
Okay.
I don't want to go back and rehash and therefore relive. I don't want to do that. I want to, my own theology is very different from Dr. Ford's. From my point of view, he was exceedingly conservative. I am much more liberal than Dr. Ford was. But why should I concentrate on that? Why should I not celebrate the fact that so many people were blessed by his ministry? That's what matters to me. When any of us is dead, do we want to be remembered for the difficulties we had, or do we want to be remembered for the positive contributions we made? So as one who did not stand in harmony with Dr. Ford, because I thought he was too conservative, not because I thought he was too liberal, I don't want to go down that street. Okay, let's take a break. It's now 11:40 in California time. Let's take 10 minutes. And the discussion will go where it goes when we come back, but you know what my preference is. Thanks a lot.
Okay.
Okay, if you take your break, raise your hand and I'll put you on our queue and just take it from there. So I see Simona, but we'll wait till break is over. Thank you, Dr. Bruinsma. Karsten? Yeah, I want to. Karsten,
Yes?
you said you lived in Battle Creek. Did you live in the Lansing area too?
No, my brother got his PhD at MSU in Lansing.
Yeah, but we had some Thompsons in the Lansing church.
Yeah, well, those were probably different Thompsons or Thompsons.
Yeah, that could be. Well, anyway, I was just curious because.
Yeah, I have a brother, Irvin Thompson, who was a preacher and started in Detroit, then in
Yeah,
Phoenix,
yeah,
Tempe,
yeah,
in
but-
California.
And that may have been Thompson. He was a builder, and
Yeah, no, that's
somebody else.
not our craft.
Okay, I'm just curious. I'll get back on silent here. I guess we're about ready to go on here. We'll wait a few more minutes here. Thank you, Karsten.
Forrest, is this a good time to begin?
It is,
Okay.
David. It
Pardon me?
is. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, it's
Ready
a
to
good
go?
time. And I've got a
Okay,
list.
and we're alternating men and women and a
Right.
2-minute limit. Okay,
Correct.
thank you, Forrest. Over to you.
Now, I'm going to go out of order here. I want to go to Ruth Christensen first. Ruth has learned how to raise her hand electronically today. So I want to give her a chance to speak first. Ruth? Nope, I guess she's not back yet. Okay, well, now go to Simona then. Simona? She's not back yet either, I guess.
I'm back.
Oh, Ruth, okay, go ahead, Ruth. Thank you.
I've said before that I grew up in a family that I felt was unusually wonderful. And in this situation, one of the things I was taught is that we were dealing with present truth, which means that it can change over time. And that was an important thing to remember. The thing that I found most important was that if we are not loving, it doesn't matter what we believe if we're not kind and loving to one another. And sometimes people in charge of running things aren't always that way. But sometimes they do change. They are sorry for the way they behaved. I've heard of a number of pastors who have said, if I had to do it over, I really wouldn't want to do it that way again. And I think that those of us who can find ways of being compassionate with all people, knowing that everybody is on the journey, and some of us will make terrible mistakes and some people will behave very well. And I liked what I was hearing today. I thought it was great.
Okay, thank you. Reinder, want to respond to that? You're muted, Reinder. There you go.
Okay, it was rather a statement than a question, but I think that the idea that we can change and that we must change when we see that change is needed, that is vital. And it's unfortunate when we come to the conclusion that we must hold true to everything that our pioneers believed, because that is the full truth. And we have shown that in some respects, we have changed and we can grow. I would just mention one thing that I did not mention before, and that is, I also have a little bit of sympathy for the leaders who were on the other side of the divide. They really felt that important things were at stake, and that if things that we had believed in since our inception would now become, would no longer stand, that would really hurt the church. Now, I don't agree with that viewpoint. I don't think that you must go that route, but I do have some sympathy and would say that by and large, most of the people on the other side of the divide were also loved their church and were doing what they felt needed to be done. That's the tragedy of the thing. But yes, you're right, Ruth, that love and treating one another respectfully and in love, that is the most vital thing.
Okay, thank you. I will now go to Karsten.
Thank you for a wonderful presentation, Reinder. Your first question, heretic or prophet? Yes, it's an and, not an or. Luther was a heretic, he was a prophet. Ellen White was a heretic in the Methodist Church, she became a prophet. And she was in good company with Jesus. He was a heretic and he got executed for it and became the greatest prophet of all time. So that's simply a natural way in the evolution of religion that revolutions come with people who are willing to stand for what they believe. In terms of the theology in the Ford discussion, Ford versus Bruinsma discussion, I think sometimes we're barking up the wrong tree. We're discussing whether my theology or your theology or the church's historical theology is right. The fundamental question, I think, is not whether we are going for a right theology. It's a basic choice of administratively the church leaders say, we are satisfied with our theology as it is. It works, it sells tickets, it gets new members, it doesn't rock the boat. Our theology is part of our branding, it's part of our trademark, and they have a very pragmatic approach to that. And we saw at the annual meeting here, the input from the theologians was totally ignored. So it's by administrative fiat, they've decided it works. And in the presentations at the autumn annual council, the House of Cards theology or vulnerability came up all the time. If we don't believe in a literal six-day creation, then the Sabbath falls. And if the Sabbath falls, we lose one of our unique trademarks. If we don't believe in 1844 and the investigative judgments, another important part of Adventist branding falls. And they, in some respects, correctly argue that these doctrines are so vulnerable that if you pull out one card out of that house of cards, it all collapses. Finally, Ford's message has been a great blessing to me. I feel freed from the fear of not being saved. When I get married, do I have to wait my whole life for an investigative judgment of my wife to determine whether our relationship was good or not? No. The salvation, the joy of marriage, the salvation, the joy of the knowledge of a relationship with Christ and his salvation, that starts the very day that you accept him. And that freedom has made all these doctrinal discussions somewhat irrelevant for me.
Also here, it's more statement than questions, and I hope it remains that way because that makes it a lot easier for me. But I think I go a long way with you, Karsten. Yes, there is both the element of heretic, or at least dissenter, and also the prophetic courage to actually state something and go against the common opinion. And yeah, theology, doctrine, correctness of doctrine is probably highly overrated, and we always forget that doctrine is a human construct, and therefore it's never perfect. It's always done within a particular frame of time and culture, etc., etc. And so if there cannot be any change, then eventually a church or religious organization will simply disappear because it's no longer relevant in any way. So there has to be change, and there has to be a fine-tuning of what is present truth at any given time in the history of an organization. So, and I believe many people will agree with you that this emphasis on grace has helped many people not to become more liberal in their lifestyle or something like that, because now they have done away with the law, but it has made them internally more at peace, and the certainty that they are actually part of God. So yeah, I think many people will agree with you that Ford and many others have helped us to see that we are saying.
Yeah, I think I could probably summarize what my wife once said about theology. She says, Sabbath afternoon, the men retreat to the living room after Sabbath lunch to discuss church politics and theology. But who's taking care of the children, she asked.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. I want to go to Simona at this time. Simona?
So I have to admit, I'm completely mystified by this. None of us hold the corner in truth. We're discussing things we actually don't know anything about. And so some latitude and grace in the way how we discuss things would be great, because how can any of us prove that we are correct? I think we put too much emphasis on some specific ordained elements of doctrine and forget the most important things. That's, how we treat each other, how good we are towards the world in which we live, towards animals and plants and everything else, instead of, thinking about things that we cannot prove or disprove. And I have to admit, I have never heard of Desmond Ford until recently. So most of this happened before I was born. Or when I was a very young child. So this doesn't hold the same weight as it does for, obviously, to some of you. And I'm not trying to discount anybody's feelings or experiences. I'm just saying that these things don't seem as important to me as the way how we treat each other.
And I think that is very true. But even though you may not have heard the name of Desmond Ford, and that would be true maybe of many church members around the world, the issues that were at play, they are still with us, at least many of them. And so in that sense, it remains important to be able to talk about that in a loving and respectful way with one another, because the issues are still there. And the need for grace in our preaching is still there.
I agree with that. I'm just saying that it seems to me that however important theology is, and it's always more important to theologians than to the rest of us, these are actually not the most important things. There was time when people were having extremely vigorous discussions about how many angels can fit on the tip of a needle, and they didn't make it important. So I'm not saying that the issues of our theology are unimportant. I'm just saying that none of us really know the truth. So a little bit more humility would be great.
Okay, thank you, Simona. Thank you very
Agreed.
much. And yeah, all right, I'd like to go to Eduardo. Eduardo.
Horace, can you take Peter first?
I could do that, but you're on deck. You don't want to speak? All right, Peter, I'm going to go to you then. Peter.
Thank you again for another interesting and challenging presentation. I heard Dr. Ford once. David was mentioning one encounter in Campus Hill Church some years ago, and I attended that meeting. And the impression that I left with was that he was a very charismatic preacher. Now, in regard to his teachings, his ideas, your question, one of the question is if it's a positive thing to search, to try to look, to search the Bible. I think it is a positive thing, and the Bible encourages this, to search diligently all things. But we should not only teach, but be teachable. And that is very important in the way we are presenting our ideas and how we support them and hold on to them. We have some negative examples in the history of the church. We have a case that is coming to my mind is David Koresh, that started having very weird interpretation of the book of Revelation. And we know how he ended up. I mean, of course, we should be kind and understanding and treat each other gently and well, but in the same time, we should not be shy of telling when we believe that something is not truth. One thing that I took some issues with was his view about the little horn. Well, I was looking historically at this, and I think he was not historically correct. Looking at the succession of the empires that it's presented with the Babylon, Medo-Persia, Grecia, and Rome, and the 10 kingdoms that evolved from the Roman Empire, the little horn appeared during this time, not in the 2nd century. Antiochus Epiphanes, as he believed, died in 146 before Christ. Then I believe this was not historically correct. Now, as a question, David asked us to emphasize his positive role, and I totally agree with him. Can you, in a systematic way, present a few of his ideas from Good News Unlimited that was playing such a positive role in the life of many Christians?
All right. Whether or not he is correct on the little horn, that is, yeah, you can look at that from different angles, of course. You know that there is a big debate among all among scholars that are dealing with Daniel in our church, outside our church. Some defend a 5th century origin or a 6th century origin of the book of Daniel. Some look at a 2nd century origin. And when you look at the various arguments, it is sometimes difficult to actually come to a final conclusion. But it should be possible, I think, to debate these things also in our church without this becoming a major upheaval, and certainly without one's job being on the line. Now, yes, you made a comparison with, or at least you mentioned Koresh. I would not like to make a comparison between those two people. I think that when something goes so totally wrong as happened in Waco, then of course the church either needs to act, or in this case needs to dissociate itself completely from what happened there. But I don't think that anything like that was happening in the case of Dr. Ford. He was a very respected university or college teacher. He was a very popular speaker. But there was a fear on the part of, in particular, the Australian leadership, that some of his ideas would create so much havoc that he needed to be dealt with. And in retrospect, as has been said, many would say it should have been dealt with differently. The good things, well, the good things, I think, to what I know about it, is that he was preaching the gospel. He was leaving doctrine in the sense of, because you cannot preach the gospel completely without any doctrine. How we look at God, how we look at Christ, it all has to do somehow with doctrine, but without some of the specific doctrines that people get so worked up about. He was preaching about what Jesus Christ was doing for people, has done for people, justification, and he did not forget sanctification, but justification, being right with God, because God is gracious towards us. That was, I think, the core of his teaching. And now some people would say that's what you can hear in many other denominations. Yeah, I wish it were true that you would hear that in so many different denominations in such a powerful way. But yeah, that's really what I want to say about Good News Unlimited. I was not very much, actually, it's strangely that in the Netherlands at the time, the Bruinsma thing was a big thing. And there were groups promoting the Bruinsma doctrine, and there were others fighting it tooth and nail. Whereas the Ford issue never became big in the Netherlands. And well, personally, I heard about these things, and in many respects, I thought, well, it doesn't sound very, that sounds pretty logical what this Ford is saying. And I leave it at that. I never made it something that I would want to preach about one way or the other. But apparently, as I have understood, certainly later, it became a very, very big issue. It really split the church in Australia and in some other parts of the world. And even today, some of the wounds have not been healed.
Well, very quickly, I just want to mention that I didn't make a comparison between Koresh
Okay, no, I
and
understand.
Ford.
Yeah,
I was just giving, in line with your question, I was giving an example that it will be a time when the church has to take a position. Of course, in a gentle and brotherly way and Christian way, but it should take a position because sometimes some people are going very far astray.
no, I understand you're not making the comparison. The church should take a position, yes, but maybe sometimes also the church should wait to take a position and let some things develop. I think history also shows that when you let things develop, they tend not to escalate to the point that they do when the feeling is we must deal with that. This is a big issue and a decision is needed, leadership is needed, etc. No, and maybe this sounds very pious, but I do also think that we should leave things a little bit more to the Holy Spirit from time to time and see how he leads in how some of these things develop.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. I would like to go to Dana. Dana?
Hi, thank you, Dr. Bruinsma, for a wonderful presentation. I raised my hand a while ago, but anyway, I will say what I wanted to say. So I was born in Eastern Europe after 57. So I don't know the story from the beginning, but I remember in the 80s how how Ford was demonized, and how if somebody would whisper his name, there will be suspicious and there will be consequences. He was presented as the Omega heresy in the church. So it's funny because these days we are talking about cancel culture, but it seems like we, the Adventists, invented cancel culture long ago. Regarding the question if he's a heretic or a prophet, I like the answer that says maybe he's both. And I think we need both sides of the story, or all sides of the story. I would have loved to hear the story that Dr. Larson can say about the bad consequences of this controversy. We need the good, the bad, and the ugly. Why do we need this? Because of two things: is the only way we can heal, and is the only way we can learn. And the key word is and, not but. Was he doing good things, but he was a heretic? Or was he heretic, but he was doing good things? Again, the key word is and. He was human, and he was doing good things, and there were bad consequences in the same time. And maybe the church had good intentions, but approached this thing in a wrong way. So when we answer the question if he was a heretic or a prophet, I think it all depends of our vantage point. Again, I believe telling the stories and listening to these stories is the only way we heal, and is the only way we learn. And if we look at the way the GC is handling the women's ordination issue, it doesn't seem that we learn much. So this is why I'm very grateful that we are telling this story.
Yeah.
And
Well,
by the way, I don't want for us to go into the trap of demonizing Ford 50, 60, 70 years ago and sanctifying him right now. Let's learn to have a balanced view right now with every issue that comes our way and with every person. Thank you.
Yeah, well, I think I agree with you. And I said before that it is important that the story be told so that people know what actually happened, and we tell the story as balanced as we can without demonizing necessarily the other side of the equation. But yes, demonizing whoever will never, but will further polarize the situation.
Okay, thank you. Now can I go to you, Eduardo?
Yes, thank you, Forrest. Reinder, let me read a quote from Desmond Ford and then ask you a question. He said, sanctification is never complete in this life.
Mhm.
He said the divine plan involves our complete restoration from sin. And then he points 3 steps. Its guilt, its power, and its presence. Our acceptance of Calvary brings the first. Our dependence upon the living Christ brings the second. And his return accomplished the last.
Mhm.
My question to you is, do you believe as he does on this issue? And also if you believe that the investigative judgment was unscriptural? That's my question to you.
Yeah. I think a lot of problems actually, Eduardo, arise from the fact that we ask that kind of question. Do you believe? And then when a person answers that, he can be categorized, he can be put in a certain category. And of course, when we talk together, and I'm not saying that you asked the question from that kind of perspective, but I'm saying that the fact that this question has been asked so many times from so many people, and people have been forced to answer that question, that has caused a lot of misery and a lot of misunderstanding, a lot of fighting, etc. So whether I believe in the investigative judgment, quite frankly, I've always found that problematic, to say the least. So, but I also know that maybe a majority of my colleagues actually have the same opinion, but will not speak out about it. And that is a tragic situation in our church, that it is not possible to actually talk about things and speak our mind without being classified. Okay, whether I agree with Dr. Ford on this tripartite view of sanctification, guilt, power, presence, and then Calvary and the living Christ and the second coming. I would like to read the whole section where he says that, rather than just replying to a quote. But as I hear this, it would seem to me that this is quite a good way maybe of summarizing what happens, that we are saved by Calvary, and that, yes, part of the sanctification process is that we receive the power to live in a particular way, and that is the living Christ in us, who helps us in that part of the sanctification process. But everything will only be complete when Jesus Christ comes at the second coming. So, well, that's what I like to say, Eduardo.
Can I have a little follow-up?
Yeah, I'll give you a minute.
Okay, I read the story of 1888, and it was very controversial.
Mhm.
And Sister White wrote to the leaders and said, you don't need to carry that spirit, even if you disagree.
Mhm.
So I don't want to fall into the same mistake,
Mhm.
trying to have the wrong spirit when I ask my questions or
Mhm.
I make my comments.
Mhm.
And David and Forrest know that I love the class. I'm being one of the first 4 people that begin the class with Roy Branson.
Mhm.
So I love you guys. But I love hard questions too.
Yeah.
Thank you for your answer.
No, that's fine, Eduardo. But I was just mentioning the fact that in all these discussions, people asking, do you believe this? Do you believe that? Do you believe that? That has often caused a lot of problems. And that should not have been necessary.
Okay, thank you. Is this Donna or Jeff? Donna, Jeff?
Yes, it's Donna, of
All
course.
right.
Sorry.
Wait a minute.
No, sometimes it's Jeff.
I'm the man of the house.
Yes, he is. He's the man of the house. And I am, yes, the voice of the house here. Okay. I wanted to say amen to Dana's comment. This is such a wonderful example of cancel culture. Jesus was a victim of cancel culture. I always think of poor Servetus on his way to the stake, the victim of cancel culture by both the Protestants and the Catholics. We just don't like to hear people speak who say something different from what we've already decided is the correct position. I heard Dr. Ford only once, and it was at the Seventh-day Baptist Church in Riverside. He had been invited to speak, I think originally at La Sierra, but the powers that be said no, not on any Adventist platform. So he was not allowed to speak either at La Sierra or Loma Linda, and someone got the pulpit at the Seventh-day Baptist Church one Sabbath afternoon. I listened. I could not see what the fuss was about. He didn't speak about anything that seemed to me to be controversial. He just said, his grace is sufficient for you, and that's the good news of the gospel. I understand from listening to people who knew him that one of Dr. Ford's problems, if you will, was that he had a very brisk personality, that he was quite strong in the ways in which he presented his views, and that irritated people, and so tended to make the conversations more adversarial than they might otherwise have been. But it was also the case that that people whom I know and respect did not speak up in his defense at a time when I think they should have, and didn't, because they were afraid of their own jobs and their own income, frankly. So he didn't have horns. I didn't see a forked tail. He was just an earnest speaker of what he saw as the kernel, the nut at the central of the central issue of the gospel. And I think it's a very sad chapter in Adventist history that we too are willing to tie people to a stake if they don't agree with the accepted doctrine. Anyway, that's all.
Thank you, Donna.
Okay, I think I have, I guess, Jan, I'm going to come to you now.
Okay, well, thank you. a man's turn here, but thank you for that. I really do appreciate. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Bruinsma, for your effort to present Dr. Ford's life and ministry in a fair light. And just really appreciate the biographical sketch you gave us at the beginning. I do wonder, you didn't mention how many SDA, and maybe that fact isn't known, but I think there were like sizable number of SDA ministers that left the church here in North America at that time. And I'm not sure why they left and Dr. Ford stayed. I find that interesting. I'm happy certainly that my brother, Jerry Webb, who was very much a disciple of Dr. Ford, stayed in the church. He's still active and preaching and just doing a wonderful work for God where he is there in Boise, Idaho. But anyway, I'm just curious, why he, so many left. I just thought that was one thing you might have pointed out in your presentation. And I do have some other things here. I don't know if you want me to take them one at a time. So I haven't spoken for a while, so I appreciate the opportunity.
We're giving you 2 minutes or 3, so.
Okay.
2 or 3 minutes, okay. So, I do agree with the ongoing need to revise our understanding of present truth. And I'm surprised by our church's silence on COVID-19 and also the need to protect our environment, to support the environmental movement. And I'm just also the fact that the rich are becoming more rich and the poor are becoming more poor. I'm just wondering how much of that is, our not wanting to touch touchy issues, just such as, we did with our treatment of Dr. Ford in the past. And I know you've taught us a lot about postmodernism. I'm just wondering if postmodernism has made people, including Adventists, more susceptible to Trumpism and the obliteration of facts and truth. For instance, just as Dr. Roy Adams presented in the Spectrum article there just recently. So I guess that's all I'll say for now.
Well, I don't know whether I want to go into Trumpism, but I fully agree with you that I would like to hear more about our social responsibility, and that Christian stewardship demands from us that we not just apply it in the way we have traditionally done, but that we also look at the present world and see what does it mean in this world to be stewards and to be Christ-like in the way we operate. So yes, and I would hope that in the future our church will be more attuned to this. And like I said, I was just disappointed that in the week when we had the week of prayer readings around the world, the conference in Glasgow was going on, and that our church was not also involved in some way with that particular issue, because that is one of the things that has to do also with our stewardship of climate and ecology and so on. Why did the pastors, that was the other question, why did the pastors leave? Well, the situation in Australia has been researched very, very carefully by this Dr. Ballis that I mentioned. In other countries, as far as I know, there has been no specific study. But I would imagine that some people felt that they had to resign because of pressure, because of problems they were facing in their local churches.
You're breaking up on us, Reinder.
Oh, sorry. A number of pastors, certainly also in Europe, they felt that, in all honesty, they were in their own views, so far away from the official view of the church that, that their integrity demanded that they would leave. Now, not all people would react the same way. Some people have felt that, yes, even if they are not in full agreement with all of the fundamental beliefs, they can still be in the church in a positive way. But some people have felt, and quite a few people have felt, that they cannot. There are lots of reasons, actually, why people are leaving the ministry. And right now in Europe, and that is not just in the Adventist church, or not particularly in the Adventist church, but overall, there is an exodus from the ministry by pastors, because they feel it's become extremely difficult to minister in at this particular point in time with all the issues that are around them.
Okay,
But-
all right. All right, we are now at 12:30. David, I have 3 hands I want to get to. I would like to comment at the end, so can we just go through what I have and then I'll turn it back over to you?
Sure, let's not cut off the conversation
Okay,
while it's
all right.
going fruitfully. So the only thing, though, is we must not presume too much on Dr.
Right,
Bruinsma's
Dr. Bruinsma.
time. That's a critical variable, but even if he has to leave, we can continue the conversation.
All right, good. Clifford Goldstein, you had your hand up. Did you want to ask a question? You're muted.
Okay.
Is
Okay,
this my-
thank you.
Is this my former colleague from Parle?
Yeah.
Yeah.
You and Parle?
Yeah, I was in Massachusetts, Southern New England.
Oh,
Conference.
okay. Man, that was a long time ago.
Yeah, I don't like to say, you look a lot older than
Yeah,
now.
yeah. Well, I get that all the time, and it's only getting worse. It's
Anyway,
only getting
go-
worse.
Yeah,
Look,
get ahead, go ahead and ask your question.
Okay, very quick background here. I never even heard of Adventists until I became one. Well, it took me about 6 months from the time I met my first Adventist, and it was 1979. And I believe I was born again. I had a born again conversion experience. I think it was actually the week Desmond Ford gave his Glacier View, no, not his Glacier View, his PUC talk. And almost from the moment I joined the Adventists, I had heard Desmond Ford, and I kind of cut my teeth on this whole thing from the very moment I became an Adventist. And I would like, I've listened to the narrative here, and I would respectfully disagree with the way some of it has been presented, but not wanting to get all agitated, which these topics tend to make me do. So I was praying before, Lord, help me be nice, help me be calm, and so on. But I guess here's the way I'll say it. I tell people it took me 8 years from the time I joined the church to where I was able to work through the issues with Ford. And I think it was very, very difficult for me because, see, it's kind of ironic. I believe the gospel the way Desmond Ford believes the gospel, the way the church believes the gospel. Okay, I think the way the church teaches the gospel now is what, and I've had friends who said the church has always taught it that way. So so in that sense, I don't really have a problem with Ford, but where I really do have a problem, and it took me years, is let me give you an example. I heard Desmond Ford at Sligo Church get up in front of the church. This could have been 25 years ago, and say, there's not a modicum of evidence for the day-year principle in the Bible. Well, come on. Had the man said, well, the day-year principle, it's obviously there, but I have a problem with how we as a church use it or view it, I'd say, okay, we could have a rational discussion here. But I think the bottom line is Ford was obviously able to give people a gospel message, but he had what I consider the folk Adventist view of the investigative judgment. And if you really understand the gospel, the folk Adventist view of the investigative judgment, they contradict each other. They can't. The typical way the average Adventist was taught the investigative judgment really was anti-gospel. And when I started to work through this, I have for years have been working, and years ago, I understand the gospel and judgment as two parts of one whole. The whole sanctuary service, from the death of the animal to Day of Atonement, second partment ministry, is gospel and judgment together. The death of the animal doesn't contradict what the high priest did on the Day of Atonement any more than Christ's death on the cross conflicts with the pre-Advent judgment or the investigative judgment. Anyway, the bottom line, it took me years to finally come to that. And so I think it was very unfortunate that it became one or the other. But anyway, that's all I want to say. I was able to harmonize the gospel with the judgment. And I know all my years, whenever I do preach on it or talk about it, that's what I attempt to do. Is I'm saved by faith in what Christ did for me, outside of me, in place of me, 2,000 years ago at the cross, period. I tell people, if I'm not saved by that, I'm lost. I ain't gonna make it. Same time too, you've got the judgment, you've got sanctification, you've got it all as one package. And it's unfortunate that we as a church have struggled to try to bring it together as one. And frankly, and I don't think Dr. Ford helped in any way at all in trying to reconcile. It was like, this is the gospel, I'm right, pre-Advent judgment's wrong, period, and that's it. But anyway, I'm done.
All right, thank you, Cliff. Okay.
Okay. I didn't hear a question.
No, all right, no, I was just making a comment then, that's all.
Yeah.
I was just making a comment. Were we supposed to ask questions?
No, you
Was
don't
that
have
the point?
to. You don't have to.
I didn't think we, Reinder and you and I are gonna argue till we're dead. You and I are gonna argue in the millennium.
Well,
okay.
Well, maybe part of the millennium, but
yeah, you and I are, anyway.
Just assuming that we'll both be there, huh? Okay, well, it's good to see you.
Okay, I would like to go to, is this Donna or Jeff again? Oh, wait a minute, hold up. No, I've got to go to George. George, you haven't asked a question yet today or made a statement.
Okay, I will make it within, let's say, give me 3 minutes, is okay?
You can buy a question, buy a vowel.
Yeah, because David mentioned something. My first contact with Ford was in by mail around 1982. After Glacier View, I got his book, and a book that many people who voted on this book at Glacier View never read it. There are many people voting there, they never read it. So in those days, I got the book, I studied, restudied, I was astonished. And I kept studying then Ronald Numbers and Walter Rea and Steve Daly, Paxton and all that. I restudied all my theology and made my mind. That brought some tension between me and the church there was very, very adamant. Even the secretary, I was not an employee, but the secretary of the division, Mario Veloso, came to my home trying to make an agreement so that I will never tell any of those things to anybody, trying to silence me. Making it short, then let's see. Then when I came to the States in 1989, November 89, 33 years ago, during those years, I wrote to Ford and he sustained my faith during those days by correspondence, by mail. It was an amazing thing because I was really disappointed. I was frustrated with the church that I trusted so much. I came to the States. 2 months later, he came to the Seventh-day Baptist Church here in Riverside for a weekend. We met the first time, and I stayed in that church for 4 years before then, for circumstances coming back where Smutsman Royan was. And I kept in contact with him several times and met him several times. He was a marvelous person. The most important thing, the most beautiful thing that I remember of him is he was an honest, a Christian scholar. He was honest. All these theologians that fought him, most of them, almost everyone, I found them dishonest. They were just loyal. It's Trumpism, loyal to the church, loyal to the GC, loyalists, dangerous people. Ford was loyal only to Christ and to the truth. He was a Christian, a true Christian, and he helped, I guess, thousands of people to keep their faith because we were duped by our own church, and I don't even know what we are still members of the same church. That's all. Thank you, Dr. Bruinsma, for the marvelous presentation, all 7 of them, and today in special. I really appreciate it. I want to see you back very soon. Thank you.
Well,
Okay.
thank you for these positive words. But George, I think that it doesn't help if we paint Ford as a complete saint and the people opposed to him as all being dishonest. I think it's much more complicated than that. People at different motives always have. Things went wrong. And yes, there is this conflict between scholarship and loyalty. And that's where we started in my first presentation. And it is difficult for many to know where their loyalty should stop and where they should speak up. When you're part of this whole apparatus, machinery that is called church, things can be pretty complicated. But I agree with you, there must come a point where we can talk about things honestly, where we can speak our opinion and without it having immediate consequences for our position in the church, our job and our income. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. All right, I'm going to come to Jeff or Donna and then Dana, and you can make your question in a minute because I'm trying to move towards the closing hour. So Donna or Jeff?
It's Donna again. Just quickly, Reinder, thank you. I add my thanks to everyone else's. I also agree with you that Gil Ballantyne's article in Spectrum a few months ago was excellent, and for the first time, at least for me, explicated a lot of what was going on around that time. I think we've talked a lot about the danger of the controversy that Ford generated by standing up and saying something, challenging a revered doctrine of the church. I think we have not said a lot about the danger of that doctrine. It was, to me at least, a terrible doctrine. I learned when I became an Adventist that Jesus had gone into the inner sanctum, or the most holy place, and was there. He and the Father were reviewing all of us, all the people that had lived. And I've told the story before in the class that I was adopted when I was fairly young, and my last name went from an S, which was Smith, to a C, which was Carlson. And I was very worried because now I had moved up in my imagination to earlier in that review. And I imagined somehow that they were going alphabetically, and they were going to get to the C's entirely too soon for my taste, because I wasn't sure about whether I had really told my cousin and confessed the fact that I had taken her nickel as well as my own when my grandmother gave them to us to buy candy one time. But my question, I guess, to you is, at what point, or maybe it's always individual, if we don't have leaders that are willing to stand up and take a position on something like this, does that not leave we lay people in more confusion and do us a disservice? I mean, you're the theologians, you're the guys and gals that are supposed to know. And if you pussyfoot around and don't say, I see that this is right, whether or not you're retired or you're in the church or out of the church. I mean, that is, excuse me, what I mean is if you are in a clerical position or not, a clerical position. I think that's a kind of betrayal of the laity that sometimes, forgive me, the clergy is guilty of.
Mm-hmm.
Would you not agree?
Do I agree? Well, as I mentioned just earlier to George Tichy, I don't think that all of our leaders are dishonest, that they believe one thing and say another thing. I think many who have opposed Ford and many who oppose the ideas of Ford today, they do so because they really believe that they should do so, and that they have that responsibility to keep the church safe in the face of false doctrine. Yes, there may be some, maybe many, who are not so sure about their own motives. And of course, motives of people are always mixed. That's true for all of us. And if you are a leader in the church, you want to keep the peace. You don't want to see controversy and disagreements, etc., etc. But in the end, I think the problem arises from a number of things. One, that we do not have enough freedom to talk about issues, and we have felt that we must have, other than that, our pioneers thought that we must have a body of doctrine that is totally defined. Every single aspect has been hammered down. That is, and we must defend that, and we cannot allow this to be discussed. That creates the problems in our denomination. And unless we are willing to allow for discussion and to allow for a fair amount of diversity, things are going to get worse, because there's going to be more polarization, there's going to be more fighting, and in the end, we all lose. So, yeah, that's how I feel, how I see things. Yeah. So, what have I said that causes total
Dana,
violence?
can you hear me?
Yes.
Dana?
Yes.
All right, your turn. And Cliff, I'm not gonna, you'll have to wait a little bit. So let me go to Dana.
Yeah, in regards the conversation and the tension between theologians and administrators and the issue of loyalty, I wanted to say that maybe we would be well served to follow what Isaac Newton said. You know, there is this quote that's attributed to him: Plato is my friend, Aristotle is my friend, but my greatest friend is truth. And I want to thank Donna for what she said about the hurt of the regular people. Because, you know, Mr. Goldstein said it took him 8 years to solve through these issues in regards to Ford's theology. As a church, and when I say as a church, I'm not talking about the GC or the administration. I'm talking about the multitude of the members of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. As a church, we are not going to solve the issue of Ford when we are going to rehabilitate him. That's not the end of the story. The end of the story is when we are going to do better next time another Ford is going to appear. Okay. Because we need to learn to be in dialogue. We need to learn to practice grace and forgiveness. We need to learn to be less dictatorial.
Okay,
and
Dana,
less
30 seconds.
exclusivistic. Okay. And so another quote: when we know better, we do better. We do the best we can until we know better. And when we know better, we do better. So we know better, we should do better next time. Maya Angelou.
Okay.
That's
okay. See, I'm looking here. I wanted to say something at the end here. I was, so if I could just take a couple minutes and then I'll come to Bronwyn and then David. But when I was a young man, I'm not sure how old I was, maybe 10, 12, 11, 12. My grandmother used to take me to the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And she worshiped in a small country church in Michigan. And they had a new pastor. And she took me one Sabbath. And this guy was preaching and he talked real funny. He had some type of accent. And my grandmother said, well, he's Australian. I never really knew too much about Australians. And I said, well, they have a good ski team, don't they? And she said, no, those are Austrians. Well, anyway, he pastored, and that pastor was Des Ford. He was going to Michigan State University, working on his first PhD. And he really gelled with the people of that little country church that was founded by Joseph Bates. My grandmother even had his daughter, she kind of held her during church service. So, you know, Des Ford was committed to pastoral ministry, committed to the gospel. And I know that little church in Michigan benefited from Des Ford. I have to say, Michigan State was 25 miles away from the Bunker Hill Church. And in the winter, it can get pretty good, but he was there basically every Sabbath. And so I look back on him with fondness, and I do separate him from theology at times. But anyway, 25 years later, I went to a meeting where he spoke. And someone asked him, should I give tithe to the Adventist Church? And his response was yes. Don't give it where you are spiritually benefited. So I believe that Desmond Ford stayed loyal to the Seventh Adventist Church, even though he did change his views, or he had different views than some of the brethren in the church. So anyway, I appreciate Des Ford, and I wanted to make a personal comment about him. So he was Elder Ford then, he didn't even have his first doctorate. So that church benefit, or Des Ford benefited my grandmother in that church in a very special way. And Bronwyn, I'm going to go to you, and then I'm going to let you turn that over to David. You're muted, Bronwyn.
Thank you. Okay, thank you. Having been there at Avondale when Des Ford taught, and Jillian, his second wife, was what you would call RA here on my floor. She was the assistant dean. And I knew her better than him. But that year was the year that his first wife died, Gwen. I was at her funeral, and I was there. I was there the day that Jillian and Des got married, which was graduation day, November of 1970. My main point I want to make is that I don't see this just as a theological fight. It's a psychological fight. If you know the story of back when, and this is in Milton Hook's book, of the story of when Des was a ministerial intern on the evangelistic team of George Burnside, he openly challenged George Burnside in a way that I believe triggered all of this off. George Burnside was one of the concerned brethren. He had a printing press that I heard ran 24 hours a day in his Sydney home, just writing things and printing things to send out against Des. I believe that he was wounded, he was hurt, and those who saw this and went along with him, it just festered and festered and festered. And this particular evangelist I know just was relentless in pushing the administration at the division to get rid of Des. So we're dealing with a lot of personalities. Donna, one of the things that to me has been the most helpful today is what Donna said. And that is about his personality and his briskness. And a lot of people felt he didn't listen to others, even though he had, a lot of good things to say. So I see this from my vantage point, growing up through all of this, and then seeing them from time to time in different places. It's very much a psychiatric and a psychological situation. And if you know the family story from whence Des Ford comes, that helps you to understand why he did a lot of what he did. Thank you. Over to you, David.
Yeah, David, to you.
Okay, thank you, everybody. I can't resist making two comments. One is that in the history of Christianity, schismatics have been dealt with far more severely than heretics. That is, people who go around causing discord and division have been sent to the stake far more frequently than people who had unusual ideas. That's one thing. I would like to comment on this issue of the honesty of people who were silent. I really think it's an unfortunate thing to say that they were dishonest, they lacked courage. I can tell you what was going on. I know this because I've talked to them, and I've talked to General Conference vice presidents about it. Let me ask you how you would answer this question. Is the moon made out of Swiss cheese or American cheese? Now, I need to have an answer to that question, and if we don't get an answer, you're not honest. A lot of people who listened to Dr. Ford and those who were opposed to Dr. Ford, the issue was so atavistic that they didn't even know what to do. Just who on earth is arguing about these things? This has had nothing to do with anything going on in the Adventist theological community, nothing going on in the Adventist Society for Religious Studies, nothing going on in the Adventist theological societies. And, you know, what do you do when someone insists on knowing what kind of cheese the moon is made out of? It was just that bewildering. One person said to me, well, we went to Glacier View to play baseball, but they were playing basketball and we didn't know how to play. So, you know, it's pretty easy to throw out charges of dishonesty. I think it was tragic because every person involved was honest to the core of his or her being. I think it was tragic because every person felt duty bound to take the position he or she did. I think it was tragic because they all thought everybody had to believe the same thing on this issue. It just, you know, it was just a tragic thing. And I don't know that there's anything other than to say that everybody who got anywhere near this got hurt. So now I want to side with Bronwyn. This is not just theological. This is a more complicated issue than that. Okay, I'm going to read a different benediction. Unless, Forrest, you have something you want to say? Okay, here we go. This is at the end of the book of Ephesians. Peace be to the whole community, and love with faith from God the Father and the Lord Jesus Christ. Grace be with all who have an undying love for our Lord Jesus Christ. Peace be to the whole community.
Amen.
Thank you, Dave.